Howdy, Central.
Howdy.
Do you know what you believe? And do you know what Easter is about? Do you know that NPR apparently did not know what Easter was about because they had to issue a retraction because they had made the statement that Easter is the day celebrating the idea that Jesus did not die, but rather arose into heaven? No. Are you familiar with the story of Easter? And you know, I am aware that there could be somebody here today who is not that familiar with the story, but you might say, yeah, of course I know the story. Everybody knows. Why do you think we're here today, Mike? But it's always good for us to revisit what happened that Easter morning. Would you open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 28 with me? Matthew chapter 28 picks up after the death of Jesus. Jesus did indeed die. He was crucified on a Roman cross, just like a criminal would be put to death. And they took him and buried him in a tomb. When we say we buried him in a tomb, that means they laid him in the tomb. They rolled a big stone in front of the tomb. They sealed the tomb. And then they posted a guard of battle-hardened soldiers at the tomb. So if we pick up in Matthew chapter 28, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb." Now, let's stop right there for a second. You know they're devastated. I mean, I'm sure everyone in the room has experienced some sort of loss. If you haven't, we know that's part of life, and grief is severe. And you know, I've lost people close to me, and it breaks your heart, and there's an emptiness there. But I want you to know that with this death, there was more than the loss of someone they loved. This was the death of hope in their lives. I want you to think about the followers of Jesus. The followers of Jesus weren't just attracted to him because he was a good teacher. They didn't just get behind him because he was some sort of revolutionary that had ideas they believed in. They really believed this was the one that their ancestors had told them about. They believed that this is the one that they had heard about all their lives. This is the one that they had hoped for, that they had longed for. The Jewish people had longed for this one called the Messiah who would come and set them free from tyranny and bondage and oppression. And the Jewish people lived under the heavy hand of the Roman Empire at this time. So they had gone all in with this man. They had gone all in following Jesus. And so they were emotionally attracted to him. They were emotionally attached to him. They were physically attached to him. Many people had left their livelihood. They had abandoned their families to follow him, and he's gone. So here they are, 3 days after he's dead, just to go visit his tomb. And things get worse. Verse 2 says, "Behold, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men." So here they had lost someone they loved. They had lost someone they had put hope in. And then there's an earthquake. A natural disaster hits. They don't need this. Happened before they got there. This is the worst day of these women's lives. And when they arrive, the tomb's open and his body's gone. Now, John, in his account of this, tells us that actually happened before the women got there, that the stone was rolled away and the angel appeared and the soldiers were immobilized, and that Jesus had left the tomb before they ever got there. And when they saw Jesus later, they actually asked Jesus if he knew where the body was taken. They didn't recognize it was Jesus. They thought he was a gardener. And they said, "Please tell us, what'd you do with the body? Where did they take him?" They didn't understand what was going on. The soldiers were there, though. This cracks me up, frankly. These trained, armed, battle-hardened soldiers paralyzed with fear. Have you ever been immobilized by fear? I got to thinking this week, when have I been really, really terrified that real harm was going to come to me? And I thought back of a time when I was a teenager, because when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, there was this hangout out in the country that was off limits to me. I mean, my parents had warned me, bad things happen there. Don't go there. So I went there. And while I was there, for some reason, I honestly don't know why, I was walking along and two guys decided They wanted to harm me. One guy had a big knife and the other one had a chain. And I was scared, y'all. So you know what I did? Well, I took off. I ran. Y'all, I was wearing cowboy boots. Usain Bolt would not have caught me. I was making time, jumped in my truck, turned the key, spun gravel, and I was gone. And I never went back to that place. I have never been so afraid I couldn't move. These soldiers were too afraid to run. Y'all, that's scared. But look at verse 5. The angel says to the women, don't be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. Now, the angel didn't tell the soldiers not to be afraid, did he? Because sometimes being afraid is in your best interest. Like when my daughter would have a boyfriend and she would say, Dad, he's intimidated by you. And I'd say, well, he's not as dumb as I thought he was, is he? That's a good boy. I want him to be intimidated. I want him to be thinking of me every time he's with my daughter. Some fear is good. It was good for the soldiers to be afraid, but the angel comforts the women. Don't be afraid, he says. You imagine showing up at this place and you're all confused and the tomb's open and there's these soldiers laying there like they're dead. They're too scared to move. And there's this angel and his clothes are gleaming. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And then he makes one of what I think are the two most profound statements in all the Bible. It's 3 words. By the way, the other statement is only 3 words. You'll have to stay to the end to get that, though. Look what he says in verse 6. He's not here, for he has risen. Amen. As he said, come, see the place where he lay. Can you just imagine what was going on in their heads? This has to be a complete disconnect from reality. When you go to the tomb to visit a loved one who's died, when you go to the grave, when you go out to the cemetery, you don't actually expect them to be alive, do you? And if somebody tells you they're alive, that doesn't line up with everything you know to be real. How can that be possible? Have you ever had something happen where you're disconnected? When I was a flight instructor, I had a guy come see me, and he needed to do a little thing called an instrument competency check. And so we went up flying one day, and normally what we do is we simulate flying in the clouds by putting a hood. You actually wear this hood where all you can see are the instruments, but it was a cloudy day. And we came out of the clouds, and we were right between 2 very smooth, level, even cloud layers. It was really neat. There wasn't much of a horizon, and you couldn't see that well. So I had him take his hood off, and we were practicing something called recovery from unusual attitudes. That's where the guy looks down, closes his eyes. The instructor puts the plane, nose high, nose down, steep bank or something, then says, look at the instruments and recover. Well, I was having a little fun that day, and I was feeling my youth, I guess. And so I told him to look down, and I started flying around a little bit, and I just did a roll. I turned it all the way over and brought it back, wings level, perfectly straight. And I said, look up. And he looked up and turned it upside down. He had no idea where he was up. He didn't even know which side was up. He didn't know up from down, left from right. He was so confused. And he just stood there. He just sat there staring. We're upside down. And he's just immobilized. He doesn't know what to do. So I turned it right side up, because that's what you should do if you're upside down. And it took this guy probably a full 2 minutes to figure out where he was. He was so disoriented. That's what I think of when I think of these women. This had to be so disoriented to them. He's not here. He's risen, just like he said. And they're thinking, what does this mean? But they start catching on, because look at verse 7. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead. And behold, he's going before you to Galilee. There you'll see him. See, I've told you. So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them on the road. Greetings. Greetings. I think he has a sense of humor. It's like, howdy, girls. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. It's quite a story, isn't it? You think about it, just on the face of it, it's quite a story. Imagine somebody telling you, hey, this guy came back from the dead. I need you to go tell people that. I remember vividly the first time I heard about Jesus rising from the grave. I wasn't raised in church, and I hated Christians. I hated Christians. Now, I wasn't an atheist. I was just a skeptic, and I was I was one of these guys, if you had said, what do you believe? Oh, I believe in God. Well, describe God to me. Well, he liked everything I liked and hated everything I hated. I created him in my own image. But I believed there was a God. I would believe there was a God that created everything and all that kind of jazz. And so, I believed that. I didn't have a problem with that. I just didn't like church people. I didn't like Christianity. I didn't like anything, but I did like girls. And I met one who said, you want to come to church and hear me sing on Easter? And I said, yep. And so I went to church on Easter, not knowing. If they had interviewed me and a man on the street interviewed and said, do you know what Easter's about? I would have said bunnies, eggs, chocolate. I honestly had no idea. I was 21 years old, and I showed up to church on Easter, and I heard this story about Jesus rising from the grave. I'd never heard anything like that before. And by the way, it wasn't hard for me to believe because I did believe in a God. And if you believe in God, you have to believe he can do something like that. If he spins the universe into existence, you have to believe that's not really that hard for him. In fact, I always get puzzled when people say, I believe in God, but I don't think he raised Jesus from the grave. Why not? Is your God too weak to do that? It must not be much of a God that you believe in. So, anyway, I sit there in tears, hearing this story for the first time. I'm in tears. I don't know what's going on. I assume I'm having a religious experience. So I went to see someone very close to me on Monday morning, and I said, I don't know what happened, but I had this experience. And this very wise, older Christian gentleman said to me, that wasn't God, that was your emotions. You need to shake it off. I tried. But stories can do that, can't they? Stories can stir our emotions. Stories can make us cry. Stories can make us laugh. Have you ever watched a TV show and you're so tense you're on the edge of your seat and your heart starts racing? They can really mess with you, can't they? We wish, in reality, that the good guys always win. That's what we want for our underlying reality. So for a moment we leave life as it is and enter into life as it should be. Life as it is hard, isn't it? It's hard, it's painful, it's tragic. Sometimes evil wins in real life, doesn't it? And what always wins in real life? Death. Death's chasing after you. It's going to catch you one day. But with life as it should be, even though life might be hard, it ends well, right? The good always triumphs over evil. So Tolkien coined this term, eucatastrophe. This is a term used in literature discussions and writing now. The eucatastrophe, we know what a catastrophe is, but the EU at the front of the word means good. So he talks about the good catastrophe. A good catastrophe, a eucatastrophe, is when everything is unraveling so badly in the story that all hope is lost, and suddenly there is a turn of events that makes everything good in the end. Wouldn't it be great if life were like that? Well, Lewis said the problem is there are no eucatastrophes in real life, so stories are just cleverly crafted lies. But here's what Tolkien said. There's one true eucatastrophe. There's one true good catastrophe that happened in real life, and it's the story of Jesus. You see, the story of Jesus is unique among all stories. There has never, ever been a story like the story of Jesus, this true story. The story of Jesus is unique, first, in its details, because Jesus is like no other. It's not, have you ever remember in school when you had to study Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, and they're just silly stories, aren't they? I mean, you've got these capricious gods that are just fanciful and deeply flawed. But when you read the story of Jesus, you're reading about a person who lived in a historical time. You're reading about a person who lived a public life in a real period of time, and the details of his life are recorded by numerous eyewitnesses, and those details are astonishing. Maybe you've heard that's not true. In fact, there's an idea floating around that the story of Jesus is just a copy of ancient myths. Have you heard that? That there are all these pagan gods, and so all the writers of the New Testament did is they just incorporated all the details of the lives of these pagan mythological deities. One of them said, to claim that your God had risen from the dead was not that unique. In Jesus' day, everybody's God had risen from the dead. Have you heard that? Maybe you've even seen this picture that always goes around Facebook every Easter. This appears on the internet every Easter. Have y'all ever seen this, or you've seen some like it? That has all the details of these ancient pagan gods and trying to show that Jesus is just a copy of those. In fact, I want us to examine this for a second. This is really fascinating to me. Let's consider the first one up here, Horus, 5,000 years ago. What do we hear about Horus? He was born of a virgin, had a star in the east, walked on water, healed the sick, restored sight. He was crucified, dead for 3 days, resurrected. But if you actually read about Horus, his mother was not a virgin. She was married to her brother Osiris. There's no historical reference to a star in the east or to Horus walking on waters. Those stories are just made up. He was never crucified. In fact, crucifixion was not even a thing 5,000 years ago. He never even died. The story is that he merged with the sun god Ra. What about Mithra, born of a virgin, born on December 25th, star in the east, 12 disciples, miracles, dead for 3 days, resurrected? Wrong. Mithra was born in either September or October. No historical account of Mithra having 12 disciples. That's also made up. Mithra wasn't said to have been born of a virgin, but came out of a solid rock. There's no known record of a resurrection or even that he died. What about Krishna, born of a virgin, star in the east, performed miracles, called son of a god, son of a carpenter, resurrected? He wasn't the son of a carpenter. He was from the royal family Mathura. He was the 8th son of Devaki and her husband Vasavita. No mention of a star in the east. No mention of a resurrection. There are some mentions of Krishna performing miracles, but I mean, he's a god, right? Then Dionysus, born of a virgin, born on December 25th, traveling teacher, turned water into wine, called holy child. You see where we're going here? You don't want to just believe everything you read, because to debunk Christianity, you actually have to make things up. To debunk truth, you have to fabricate something. By the way, Dionysus wasn't born of a virgin. His mother was Semele, a mortal, and his father was Zeus. He died every winter and was resurrected in the spring, but he did this every year. There's no mention of December 25th. Now, we have to say this. He did turn water into wine, but he was the god of wine. So he turned stuff into wine. So it says here, Jesus, all of the above. You know what I would check? Jesus, none of the above. There is no other story like the story of Jesus. This is why the resurrection of Christ was the cornerstone of the earliest Christian preaching. And it was controversial because no one had ever heard such audacious claims. Let me give you one example. In Acts chapter 17, you read about the Apostle Paul going to the city of Athens. Athens was the cultural center of Greece. So in Athens, they worshiped all the gods, and they knew about all the gods, and this is where the philosophers like to hang out. This was like the epicenter for philosophical talk and study and all this kind of thing. So Paul goes to Athens, and he's looking around at all the many altars and monuments to all the pagan gods, because if you wanted to know about any of the pagan gods, this is where you went. They worshiped all of them there. They even had a monument set up that said, "To an unknown God." They just wanted to cover all their bases. So Paul comes in and starts talking about Jesus. And all the philosophers said, "Hey, we want to get together with you because we know about all the gods. We don't know about him. We need you to tell us about him." So they go to this place called the Areopagus. And they go to the Areopagus, and Paul starts telling them about Jesus. And the way you read the story, he's telling them all about Jesus. He's telling them about the one true God. And it's like they're all standing around going, okay, yeah, well, I can believe that, because they believed anything. Yeah, okay, I go into that. He had the Stoic philosophers, the Epicurean philosophers, two totally different sets of worldview. And then he started talking about the resurrection of Christ, and the conversation ended. Why did the conversation end? Because he had gone too far when he started talking about that. It says that the majority of them started mocking him. What are you talking about, somebody rising from the grave? Because nobody does that. That was just too much to be conceived. And a few people were curious. Why were they curious? Because they'd never heard anything like that. So here, 2,000 years later, some guy gets on the internet and says, "Oh yeah, everybody's God rose from the dead," when the truth is, nobody's God rose from the dead. It's all fabricated. It's all made up. The story of Jesus is unique in its details, especially because of the resurrection, but that's not all. The story of Jesus is unique in its very nature. Because Jesus is the ultimate underlying reality. We're all longing for this ultimate underlying reality where things turn out right, and this is what we find in Jesus. He is what every heart is longing for. We're longing for a reality where everything is made right in the end. We're longing for a reality, as C.S. Lewis said, where sad things come untrue. And that reality is Jesus. The story of Jesus is remarkable, but how do we know it's not just another good story? How do we know that it's real? How do we know the story of Jesus Christ is true? We know it because of the resurrection. The resurrection is what the apostles cited as proof of everything about Jesus. It validated his life and death. The apostles didn't go around trying to prove the resurrection. Have you noticed that in Scripture? They didn't go around saying, hey, here's evidence for the resurrection. Here's all the truth. There's only one place, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul does that because some people are denying everyone is resurrected. And what does he use for proof that everyone's going to have a resurrection? The resurrection of Christ. They weren't giving proof for the resurrection. The resurrection was the proof because Jesus was killed publicly. He appeared alive publicly, and everyone knew it. So when the apostles are talking about Jesus, they say, but we know it's true because you all know he rose from the grave. And the listeners are going, well, yeah, we do know he did that. There's a Jewish historian named Josephus who says, yeah, Jesus rose, he came back to life. They killed him, he came back to life. He was not a Christian. How do we know Christianity is true? Because Jesus is alive. He came back to life just like he said he would. That validates everything else. You may have doubts about Christianity, but let me tell you, you can't get around the resurrection. You can't get past that. So you have doubts, you're unsure about this, you're unsure about that. The resurrection nails it. As one Oxford historian said, there's no one fact in the history of mankind proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort than the fact that Christ died and rose from the grave. The documentation, the eyewitness testimony, the empty tomb, and a host of other evidences scream, he is risen. So that longing in your heart, that longing in your heart that you can't identify but you also can't deny, that longing I had in my heart that I didn't even come to terms with until I sat in that church in 1987 on Easter Sunday and heard the story of Jesus, that longing in your heart is actually a longing for Jesus. God created you not to be satisfied with this world. God created you with an emptiness within you that can only be filled by himself. Because Jesus himself said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. So here's our takeaway on this Easter Sunday morning. Turn to Jesus and live. You need to understand, I don't want you to turn to Jesus because his is a better story. I want you to turn to Jesus because his is a true story. I don't want you to turn to Jesus because he has a better way. I want you to turn to Jesus because he is the way. I don't want you to turn to Jesus because he gives you a better life. I want you to turn to Jesus because he gives you an eternal life. And he says, no one comes to the Father except through me. No one. Why do I want everybody to be a Christian? Because I want everybody in on the truth. It's true and it's real. No one else has defeated death by rising from the grave. No one else has the power to save. No one else can do what Jesus has done. No one else backs up his claims. No one else is alive and alive to save today. So I would plead with you, don't turn your back on the truth. Don't turn your back on life's ultimate reality. Don't turn your back on the only way that all sad things come untrue. Turn to Jesus and live. Let's pray.